Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the International Solidarity Pod, which is a podcast that aims to explore current affairs and history relating to imperialism, the global south, gender, political economy, and people to people ties. I'm your host, Ashwin. Today, we commemorate and discuss the 80th anniversary of the victory against fascism in Asia. But before I tell you more, I'd like to draw your attention to a site called lifelineforgaza.com. That's lifeline, the number four, gaza.com. This website serves as a resource that compiles the various donation links to individual families in Gaza. The way it works is that the donation links that have not yet received a donation in the past 5 days get prioritized and get bumped up to the top. So please, I encourage you to donate using that link. Um, this is especially relevant when we're talking today about fascism and imperialist aggression in Asia. There's no, greater fascist force today than the Israeli regime and the United States, which are, hell-bent on destroying the Palestinian people, their will and their politics. These folks in Gaza are trying to survive amidst orders to evacuate Gaza City as the Israeli regime looks to occupy Gaza City. People need hundreds of US dollars these days to even buy a tent, let alone fees for, getting a car or some kind of transport to move yourself and your belongings to the south. So, please donate to that link. I'll have it written in the description below. In this episode, I'm joined by two members of the Qiao Collective to discuss a number of things related to the 80th anniversary of the victory against fascism in Asia. We first discuss, the new Chinese film, Dead to Rights, which is a very popular film, whose story looks at the Nanjing massacre, a key moment in World War II in China. We then discuss China's broader role in World War II and how its contributions are severely underappreciated in the Western narrative of the war. Finally, we discuss the significance of China's Victory Day parade that just took place on September 3rd, as well as the US's drive for war against China today. If you aren't yet familiar with Qiao Collective, please check them out. I've left links in the description below to their website and their Instagram. Lastly, as I mentioned in the previous episode, I have started a Patreon where you can contribute small amounts of money to support the sustainability of this show. You can join as a member for free, and I think even there's merit in that because, we're trying to, like I said, diversify the platforms that this program is on. So you can join as a member for free or for, at the paid level, which is, I believe it's about $4 a month or $5 Canadian a month. And if you'd only like to make a one-off contribution, you can do that as well on Patreon by using the gift option. Uh, I should say though, if you're inclined to make a contribution to the Patreon, I would advise you to first contribute on lifelineforgaza.com, and then if you have extra, then feel free to contribute it to the show, and that would be much appreciated. As usual, you can find the work I do on Instagram at Journal of INTL Solidarity and on Substack at intlsolidarity.substack.com. Please leave a review if you're listening to this on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, as it helps get this program to new listeners. Okay, without further ado, here's my conversation with Jin and Charles from Qiao Collective. Thank you both for coming on. Welcome to the International Solidarity Podcast. So today we'll be talking about the 80th anniversary of the victory against fascism in Asia. And I say in Asia because, this often, especially in Western media, gets framed as China's military parade, and that's pretty much it, right? But this really is about the rest of East Asia, right? Japanese aggression was extensive across Asia. Korea was very much, part of this struggle. Even the struggle against Japanese imperialism was a joint struggle between the Chinese and the Koreans. The Japanese aggression extended down into the Philippines, into Vietnam. Vietnam fought a fierce war against the Japanese before they had to take on the French, before they had to take on the Americans, and so hence, I think just to put that on the table that the framing as well is important, right? That this was a victory against fascism in Asia, and under recognized as a contribution to the Second World War, and we'll come to talk about that. But maybe first, I'd like you to briefly introduce yourselves, introduce Qiao Collective, and as well, Qiao Collective had recently published two pieces sort of based on speeches commemorating this 80th anniversary. So we'll start with Charles. Go ahead, please feel free to introduce yourself and Qiao Collective as well as the pieces, and then we'll move to Jin.
Great. Thanks so much for having us on, Ashwin. It's a really pleasure to be on the podcast. And yeah, so my name's Charles. I'm a member of Qiao Collective, have been since 2020. For those who aren't familiar, we are an anti-imperialist Chinese diaspora media collective. We were formed originally at the height of the early COVID pandemic to challenge sort of xenophobic imperialist propaganda, especially in the Western media. Um, but our mission has broadened a little bit to include really sort of explorations of China's history and ongoing practice of socialist construction and of socialist internationalism. So, it's in that spirit, of course, that we published these two latest pieces. For those who might have some familiarity with your work, you might be relieved to know that they're quite a bit shorter than usual because they're transcripts of two relatively short, snappy speeches. And they were basically both speeches were delivered, a few weeks to a few months in advance of September 3rd, which is what is officially commemorated as Victory Day in China. And that was the date, of course, of the 80th anniversary military parade that just happened, and which there was some discourse about. So, we basically have this understanding, as you mentioned, that while in terms of absolute numbers, China absolutely sacrificed the most, partly as a function of its large population, partly as a function of having fought Japan for 14 years continuously. It did not fight alone in the anti-Japanese war of resistance. And while so many in the West, might be familiar with these narratives that, oh, it was the United States that was China's principal or only ally, right, in this struggle. As you mentioned, those who really fought and bled and sacrificed the most alongside China were other colonized Asian peoples. So, we were basically thinking about the fact that the United States, after in its narrative defeating Japan almost single-handedly, right, took the place of Japan as the imperial hegemon in East Asia, and continued and sort of extended Japan's sort of violent path of aggression against Korea, against China, especially by way of Taiwan, against Vietnam as well, and left behind, particularly to this day, in China and Korea, divided polities, right? Divided along the Korean DMZ, divided along the Taiwan Strait, in ways that, particularly in the case of Taiwan, have led to dramatically differing memory cultures surrounding not just the Cold War, but even now, the actual historiography of the war of resistance against Japan. And so that's why one of the pieces that we included was a speech by a member of the Labor Party of Taiwan, which essentially is a revival of the pre-war Taiwan Communist Party, which was banned first by the Japanese colonialists and then by the KMT. was revived after the so-called transition to democracy, and which hews to a pro-unification socialist position. And this was a speech that he gave at a conference in Okinawa, talking about you know essentially the collusion between separatist forces that are now governing Taiwan and the especially reactionary regimes that until recently governed South Korea as well, basically in order to undermine the post-war order in East Asia, and align South Korea and Taiwan respectively much more not just with U.S. imperialism but with Japan, which we see in the Japan in the JACUS, Japan, Korea, U.S. Trilateral alliance, and also with systematic efforts by so-called Taiwan independence forces to rewrite the history of Taiwan, to whitewash Japanese imperialism, to pull closer to Japan in the hopes that they will actively intervene, in the case of any sort of military conflict with mainland China, right? So that's a very disturbing development. It's also something that was the core of my speech, the second of the two pieces that we published, which was delivered for a Korean Liberation Day event here in Los Angeles, hosted by our comrades in Noruto. Um, Korean Independence Day, coincides with the anniversary of not Japan's formal surrender, but Hirohito's announcement of the surrender, which was August 15th. And so it was a few weeks before. But very much in the spirit of this ongoing contestation around the how we remember the defeat of Japan. I mentioned the fact that when Japan surrendered, it was on the deck of a U.S. Navy ship, and seven of the nine signatories, on the Allied side were Western colonial powers. The exceptions were the USSR and China. And, this, of course, was entirely unrepresentative of who really did the fighting and the dying in that titanic struggle.
Thanks for that, Charles. Jin, go ahead. Maybe just briefly introduce yourself, your involvement with Chiao, and if you had anything to add on those pieces.
Yeah, it's really great to be here with you. My name is Jin. I'm a member of the Qiao Collective since about the beginning of this year. I'm really excited to talk about, the 80th anniversary of the people's victory against Japan, not only from like a historical perspective, but how much that story, that history shapes our perception of China today and where, what kind of light it could shed for, the direction that we're heading, whether it be towards war or peace. I think it's a very important conversation for us to highlight here today. Thank you so much for having me here.
Yeah, of course. And we're certainly going to touch on some of those themes. I mean, I think the plan for this conversation is essentially, well, first I want to get your thoughts on, uh, the movie Dead to Rights, commemorating the Nanjing massacre. We'll do that first, then we'll talk about, China's role in World War II, how, it's sort of underappreciated, not focused on. Um, we'll move to talking about the Victory Parade itself, the sort of politics around it, the coverage of it, that kind of thing. And, we'll wrap up by, um, you know, talking about dimensions of the new Cold War, perspectives of, war on China, and, war in East Asia more broadly. Like I was telling you, it is a little bit of an ambitious agenda. Let's see, how much we can get through. But yeah, no, first let's, uh, you know, we've all watched, Dead to Rights, this really well produced, high quality film, um, you know, released in China and, in parts of the world. I was able to watch it where I am here in Canada. Um, we'll just do one round on, sort of personal reflections, takeaways from this. This was commemorating the Nanjing massacre. In a lot of ways, sort of the most brutal, um, uh, event you can say, maybe in sort of the Chinese national liberation struggle in the Chinese effort toward effort in World War II. So, some personal reflections here after having seen the movie. Maybe we'll start here with Jin.
Yeah, I think, I mean, first of all, it was an incredibly well-made movie. I think just like a quick note on movie making in general, we all understand Hollywood is this driving force of global propaganda for the last like decades and decades. I remember like as a child, right, when you watch movies, it was all American movies. None of it was ever about China. If there was ever like an Asian character, it was probably racist. And I think it was around maybe the second Transformers movie. This is like niche Chinese collective memory for movies. But it was either the second or the third, but there was like a part of it where I think they were battling their way through Shanghai, and there was a sort of a montage of like Chinese signs and things like that. It was either in Shanghai, Hong Kong, I can't remember the details, but that was huge in China. We were always just so excited to see our city being reflected in this Hollywood blockbuster. And I think that was kind of a turning point for Hollywood where the movie became such an incredible economic success in China that the financial powers that be in Hollywood realized that the Chinese movie market was going to be this new big thing. And then moving forward, you saw like with the Marvel movies, all of those, without the Chinese movie theater, would have movie market would have literally been half the economic success that it was. And China being China, weren't just satisfied with giving all of our money to Western Hollywood. And so I think that was the era when China started developing its domestic movie production capabilities, leading up to today with the release of films like Dead to Riot that is incredibly like cinematically powerful, very well produced. It's just like visually beautiful and it tells such a good story and it's able to hold like economic success in the global market. I think this is, a great side story for like even in the field of entertainment, how China is rising to become this power that is now finally able to shape history by telling its own history in this like popular media format. So that's my biggest takeaway from the movie is just that it's a really good movie objectively. Um, I remember then the movie Nanjing came out, I think in I forgot when, but it was one of the first like big movie that was made about the Nanking massacre. I think I watched it when I was in middle school. Incredibly traumatizing, honestly, to watch, but a very important piece of history for everyone to remember. And I think my biggest takeaway from watching these films about the subject is that like it made me feel like personal sacrifice was just such a almost insignificant part of our war against like fascism, aggression, militarism. Because I mean, if you see the movie Dead to Riot, I think they did a really good job portraying every character with like a complete story arc. Specifically, I'm thinking about the traitor Guang Hai. He actually had like a pretty I think in-depth story arc. You sort of see him falling apart. You see him breaking the whole time, even though he was being this horrible person. He had like internal conflict that was pretty well exemplified through his interactions. Um, but I think one thing that stood out, like that scene where, you know, all of his entire like everyone he knew was getting shot and he was just like standing there with the Japanese. It really like, highlighted how he felt like his life was more important than like hundreds and thousands of other people. I think that's a type of sentiment that, is it's human to have in a way because you're cowardly, you're scared of death and stuff like that. But then when you look at our own revolutionary history, our own ancestors' sacrifice, it kind of like uproots that sentiment within you. It highlights an importance of unity, of personal sacrifice in order to achieve a goal that's far greater than yourself. And that, not no one's life is more important than anyone else. And I think that's my takeaway from the film.
Go ahead, Charles.
Yeah, I definitely second everything that Jin said. Um, especially the sort of broader context of this film, of other, Chinese war blockbusters that have come out recently, particularly, regarding the Korean War, right? In sort of commemoration of various 70th anniversaries as they've passed, where it's really about asserting primarily to a Chinese domestic audience that has been raised so much on a westernized cultural diet in recent decades, but also to the world. The sanctity of China's historical memory, against all of these like distorting and obscurantist Western narratives. But in the case of debt to rights, specifically, I was really struck and moved by the storyline's focus on this one sort of photo studio, right? The movie's title in Chinese, Nanjing Zhaoshangguan, is literally means just Nanjing photo studio, and that's where most of it takes place. That's where the central contradiction takes place as well for the main characters who are and I guess this might be a little spoilery, but who are basically like conscripted into developing film for a photographer in the Imperial Japanese Army, which includes both like propaganda oriented towards their narrative of benevolent occupation and Chinese Japanese friendship, and evidence of absolutely horrific war crimes, like unspeakably horrific. Um, and what's depicted on screen in this film is really only the tip of the iceberg compared to what actually happened historically during the massacre, right? Um, and through all of this, I couldn't help but think repeatedly of Gaza, right? Where you have as well, sort of updated to the modern technological age, in a genocidal occupying colonial force that is documenting and in fact often live streaming its own war crimes. And I think the film does a really good job of breaking down the different functions that this plays in terms of propaganda, right? Where evidence of these atrocities, right? Like they kind of have to decide, like, okay, do we bury this for the purposes of PR, or do we, publish it, right, in order to both demoralize the enemy, make them feel that resistance is futile, right? Sort of recruit more collaborators, like this Wang Guanghai character that Jin referenced, uh, and also kind of build up a really like sick morale booster for ourselves and for our domestic home front, right? And I think that last factor is something that's really key in the context of the current genocide in Gaza, where in the absence of any kind of real military victories, like the reason why IOF soldiers are like live streaming themselves, like blowing up buildings and documenting all the war crimes is to give some semblance of victory and of total domination to an extremely bloodthirsty public, right, within the settler colony. Um, and beyond those parallels, something else that really occurred to me during the movie was the fact that the reason or the character's survival strategy, right? The ones who are staying in this photo studio is essentially to leverage the fact that like they control this small part of the necessary means of production, right? Necessary to the occupation. And so it's like a small little outpost of like actual like economic sovereignty and self-sufficiency in the midst of the absolute like total ruination and social devastation that's going on because of the Japanese occupation all around them. And so, that I found to be quite symbolically important as well. And it's juxtaposed very effectively, I think, in this final montage with the sort of really important sort of socially reproductive role that the photo studio played for Chinese society in times of peace, right? They have like this montage of photos that were taken of people in pre-war Nanjing commemorating life events, right? Preserving, the memory of Chinese society before the war, so that it's not destroyed. Um, and of course, you also have this scene where there's a montage of painted backdrops from all across China, including some places that are under Japanese occupation. And all of that really enforces, I think the importance of territorial integrity, of sovereignty, at a level that's really emotionally affecting, and where you can understand, how these individual characters, are moved to do what they do, and to make the ultimate sacrifice, for almost all of them, right? In the cause of resistance, and also of documenting these crimes, in what appears in that moment to be the futile hope that in fact their occupier will lose and will face accountability. And that I think is something that's very important for us in this moment as well.
Those are great reflections from you both. I mean, like genuinely very deep and yeah, just great reflections. I mean, on the content itself, but also, Jin, I really appreciated your perspective on, stepping back and looking at what role does media play, what role does art play in sort of um I guess revolution in terms of building society, having social, bonds and social cohesion, that kind of thing. I'm going to try to reflect off of, some of the things that you folks have been saying. Um, I mean, I agree with you, Charles. I mean, you, it, I can't imagine anyone watching that movie without thinking about Gaza essentially the whole time. Um, yeah, and it's insane. And I sort of wanted to talk about the what I saw maybe, and feel free to tell me your thoughts on this, but what I saw is sort of maybe the climax of the film, at least from my perspective, maybe based on the things that I sort of think about. But it's exactly at this point where this traitor character, Wang Guanghai, he's talking to. I, it's been a month since I watched this, so hopefully I don't make any errors. But I think it was his mistress. He was talking to his mistress. Um, I forget the context. I think they were trying to escape the photo studio, but he was talking to his mistress. His mistress was casting doubt on him because he was a traitor, and saying, what happens? What's going to happen to you? How are you going to think about yourself? How are you going to live with yourself after, we are liberated, after the Japanese leave? And Wang Guanghai, like, responds by saying, "What do you mean? The Japanese came, invaded Dongbei, Manchuria in 1931. Before that, they took Taiwan in 1895. And then so on and so forth from 1937, in Nanjing, and he basically outlines this history of Japanese incursion and buildup, and you know, uh, sort of to what you were saying, Charles, having that psychological capture of the colonized, of the native, right? Colonizing the space in their mind and colonizing their imagination to normalize and eternalize the presence of the occupier, and you really see that come through um, in this moment, when he's saying, what do you mean, when the Japanese leave, he essentially takes it for granted that they are going to be here, forever, that there is going to be, he even says, once the war is over, the Japanese will, formalize their rule here. And, he's positioning himself to have some kind of role of survival there. And it also does remind me, of the situation in Palestine and with Palestinian politics. I've paid quite a bit of attention to the analysis of Abdul Jawad Omar on especially on Millennials Are Killing Capitalism, where he talks about this being a major sort of fault line, I guess, in Palestinian politics. I guess I won't go too much into it, but about the fault line being collaboration versus and maybe collaboration isn't the best word, because there's also an element of survival there, right? You need to do what you can to survive, but collaboration, for lack of a better word, on one hand, and sort of unabashed, unapologetic resistance that is very risky in a very high tech militarized, hyper surveillance kind of apartheid system that the Israeli regime enforces, across the occupied Palestinian territories. And so yeah, I mean, these are some parallels. Uh, to go off of what you were saying, Gene, about the role of media and how this is a well-produced film, and I really do think it's important to stress that um, this is in contrast to, or you can't see this without the background of Western media being dominant media and having captured the imaginations of people around the world. I mean, I grew up in Hong Kong, and growing up in Hong Kong, if you're consuming English language media, I know that from when I was a kid, I was watching kids channels like Nickelodeon, which are American channels being broadcast from the Philippines. So you have those colonial dynamics, and this sort of captures the imagination not just of non-Chinese kids like myself in Hong Kong, but even, Chinese kids in Hong Kong. And maybe, a short thing I'll say about that is I went to watch this film, Deterrence, with a friend of mine, Chinese person from Hong Kong. And, their understanding of this history was sort of minimal, and that surprised me. We're both from Hong Kong. She's Chinese, and so one would maybe think that there's a better sense of it. We talked about to what extent did we learn this at school, and she was talking about how you do learn this at school to some extent, but it's rote memorization, so it doesn't get solidified, and that I think shows ever more the importance of a sovereign country needing to use media and art to, to have a sense of your own story, right? The story of you as a people, and I think that's very important. It's part of sovereignty, right? When you're, when you're building a sovereign project uh, in dialogue or in relation to Western dominance, right? Western imperialist dominance, which captures your imagination. This is one terrain, the terrain of media, uh, also needs to be very much contested, in that pursuit of sovereignty. Yeah, maybe last thing I'll say there, I've been going on for a bit, is that I see this a little bit. I'm obviously drawing parallels with the Indian movie industry as well. I mean, it's a little disappointing that Indian cinema has a long history, really, and there are different regional industries as well. But here I'm talking about the Hindi film industry based out of Mumbai, colloquially called Bollywood, right? Uh, has a long history of dissemination across all of the world. You talk to older generations of people from West Asia, from the former Soviet Union, different parts of the former Soviet Union. They know Indian films, that kind of thing. It's sort of a shame to see, many Indian films these days, whenever they do touch on quote unquote politics, it really is to sell this um, jingoed up, hyped up version of Indian militarism, against sort of fictional enemies, that kind of thing. But I should say, there are some really good anti-colonial movies, from the time of British colonization, to differing levels there's a spectrum of factuality, how much it's based in being loyal to actual history. But I think a movie that I will shout out is Sardar Udham. This was, and the actor was or the principal character was played by Vicky Kaushal, a very famous actor. And Sardar Udham was one of the early communists in Indian history, part of the Hindustan Socialist Republican Association, which modeled itself actually off of the Irish Republican Army. It was about Udham Singh, who was Bhagat Singh's comrade, that was taking revenge against I forget his name now. Doesn't matter. British colonialist, who directly oversaw and ordered the Jallianwala Bagh massacre in 1919. Anyway, I've gone on for way too long. Check that out if you can. I would highly recommend it. And again, like I said, this kind of media is very important for sovereignty, across the global south. Okay. If there's nothing to add to that, we will transition to, talking about China's role in World War II. Like we were, talking about, this is there really is sort of a distorted memory of China's role in World War II. Again, even I mentioned I grew up in Hong Kong. I grew up in China itself. In history, you don't. You learn a lot more of the European theater than you do, the Asian one. How important is it that we emphasize and bring to light this history as we've been talking about? Some reflections on that first. Maybe we'll start with Charles.
Yeah, absolutely. I think to sort of like ground uh, my perspective on this discussion, one one framing of World War II that I've found to be quite helpful comes actually from Ernest Mandel, who was a Belgian, I think, Trotskyist, but a smart Trotskyist and a Trotskyist who was way more supportive of actually seeing socialism than most that you encounter today. So, um, yeah, there's one piece that he wrote in 1976 where he basically said that what we think of as the Second World War was in reality, and I quote, a combination of five different wars, and then he lists them out. And I think it's important to like be very cognizant about these distinctions between different theaters globally, right? He says first there was an inter-imperialist war, a war between the Nazi, Italian, and Japanese imperialists on the one hand, and the Anglo-American French imperialists on the other hand. That was a reactionary war, as Ray says, right? And that is the memory of World War II that actually, pretty much monopolizes the historical commemorations in the West. And second, there was a just war of self-defense by the people of China, an oppressed semi-colonial country, against Japanese imperialism. But then he goes on and he says, third, there was a just war of national defense of the Soviet Union, a worker state, against an imperialist power, namely Nazi Germany. He says, fourth, there was a just war of national liberation of the oppressed colonial peoples of Africa and Asia, launched by the masses against British and French imperialism, sometimes against Japanese imperialism, sometimes against both in succession, one after the other. And that, of course, was the picture in most other parts of Asia, right? And then he says the fifth war, which is the most complex, was a war of oppression, a war of liberation by the oppressed workers, peasants, and urban petty bourgeoisie against the German Nazi imperialists and their stooges in Europe, right? Basically, the partisan war. So, you know, when we talk about World War II, we're really talking about a historical memory that's fractured along those lines, and really according to, which camp in the world today you belong to, right? Um, so as I mentioned, it is the first war, the inter-imperialist war, that gets all the attention in the West. But what China, and to an increasing extent Russia as well, refer to as the World Anti-Fascist War, right? That was part of the official title of this commemorative event in China, refers to all of the other wars, right? And they were global in scope. It was the war of self-defense and national liberation, not just of China, but of the USSR, right? Its great patriotic war against Nazi Germany. It was the war of the anti-colonial partisans in Europe, in Asia, and in Africa, right? And all of those stories are systematically left out of the narrative in the West, because they complicate this picture, right? That it was principally Britain, right? Along with other Western European powers that held it down against the Nazis in Europe, and that it was the U.S., in its Pacific War against Japan, that turned the tide in the Asia Pacific theater. And if you look at who actually was tying down the vast majority, in most cases 80% or more, of both the Nazi forces and the Imperial Japanese forces, it was the USSR and China, respectively. And that's why, you had in this year, 2025, right, 80 years on from 1945, the world's basically two largest anti-fascist gatherings in Moscow in May 9th for their Victory Day parade, and then in Beijing on September 3rd for China's parade. And there was a very glaring absence from both, right? Which was basically all of the Western allies of World War II. There are a handful of Eastern European countries, Slovakia and Serbia, right? Who sort of by in a contingent way have perhaps more Eastern friendly governments now who attended, but you had no official representation whatsoever from the U.S., from Britain, from France, and so on, from the vast majority of countries that officially accepted Japan's surrender and Nazi Germany's surrender, right? And I think that speaks to the fact that the West secretly has a very guilty conscience, I would say, about the fact that it reincorporated and rehabilitated the defeated fascist powers of World War II in a way that very intentionally did not reform them, right? Did not reconstruct them. The process of denazification in Germany was incredibly shallow in the West, in the Western occupied portions. Most Nazis were rehabilitated. Many of them were incorporated into the NATO command structure, and then it was even more, blatant in Japan, where the U.S. basically gave amnesty and allowed Hirohito to remain in power. They also indemnified the commanders of Unit 731, the absolutely horrific biological warfare facility that Japan established in occupied northeast China in Manchuria. There's going to be another Chinese film actually coming out about that in just a few days, I think. But yeah, they basically pardoned all the commanders of that facility, used their biological warfare or the results of their biological warfare research against Korean and Chinese people in the Korean War, and more broadly speaking, rehabilitated the vast majority of Japanese war criminals, and in fact reinstalled them in power in order to prevent Japan from turning not just socialist, but even non-aligned, right? So as to retain Japan as like a forward base against this rising tide of Asian communism in Korea, China, and Vietnam. And that's the role that continues to serve today. And because the relativization and the minimization of both Nazi and Japanese fascism, served such a useful role in the Cold War against communism, and continues to do so today in the new Cold War being waged against both China and Russia. That's why it's more important than ever to insist on who really fought and sacrificed the most in the world anti-fascist war. And that really is the underlying narrative behind the commemorative events that we had both in Beijing and in Moscow this year.
Go ahead, Jin.
Yeah, I think, as we all know and see every day, this like idea of US supremacy is like daily collapsing in front of our eyes. We see it in our material reality, the roads that never get fixed, the wars that Americans are waging, the genocide in Gaza, but then also dialing it back to history. I think facing the correct version of our history is going to be the thing that really drives the nail in the coffin for US imperialism. And I say that because, I mean, just on a personal level, anecdotally, when you speak to other leftists and you talk about their personal history in connection with communism, socialism, these ideals, very often you hear that, learning these theoretical fronts also help people reconnect with their history. And I think that's very important in when you look at Japan today and South Korea today, and also Taiwan. When you don't face, your own history against fascism, against imperialism, colonialism, um, you're very lost either as a person or as a nation. In the case of like Charles was saying earlier, the reinstallation of fascist powers, of Japanese fascist powers in South Korea and Japan, it was very real. They literally took the same people that were in power during occupation and put them back into power under US guidance. When we think about Japan's history of fascism, it didn't like come out of nowhere. Japan was opened by the United States. It was America that was responsible for this entire chain of events. Japan got one of its first taste of imperialism and conquest when it invaded Beijing along with seven other Western imperialist powers in the 1900s to put down, a peasant rebellion that was against the Qing dynasty, against empire. So, when you look at Japan's its own history toward like military escalation in the region, so much of it was like led by Western imperialist powers. And so I think today Japan's education and history books often doesn't reflect its own, brutal history of occupation, imperialism in Asia. And I think that is to the detriment of Japan's people because, Japan has been under the leadership, quote unquote, of the LDP for the last pretty much since the end of the war, right? Um, its own society is suffering under like they're the big one of the biggest puppet of US imperialism, and their own people are suffering, but they're not able to like forge a force of leftist struggle within its own like Japan because it has like not no ability to reconcile with its own history. So this act of like rewriting history that America has led over the last decades and decades of World War II has real impact today on the ideological formations of our people, either in Asia or here in America. And I think China's military parade and the release of these films are a really good, important highlight of how, of the importance of facing your own history in order to lead the world's people toward a peaceful future. The reason why Chinese people are able to be like this, like frontier of socialism, frontier of like mutual prosperity, South-South-South cooperation, and uplifting a multipolarity of people across the world is because we did overthrow imperialism. We overthrew US imperialism, Western aggression, and we're able to confront that history and that shed light to how to move forward. And then when you look at the reality division on the Korean Peninsula, it's a very painful highlight to how America has, through its like memory and military co-optation of history, been able to essentially rob our people of the fruits of our victory, right? For the people of Korea, they fought and died for decades against Japanese colonialism, but then now to this day are remain divided and unable to access their own homelands. In the same way for China too. I think um, for the military parade, a lot of people, especially on the West, focused on the nuclear arsenals that China unveiled. And I think the nuclear question is extremely prevalent for today and also back in the 1950s. We like to talk a lot about the nuclear pariah states, whether it be North Korea or now China with our, shiny new nukes and delivery systems, but we don't talk about, the only country that has ever dropped nuclear weapons on the world, which is America. We don't talk enough about how a lot of people think that it really wasn't necessary to drop the nuclear weapons, and certainly not necessary to drop it twice. And then America was only able to engage in this sort of behavior because of, racism against Japanese people and dehumanization of Japanese people and Asian people in general. Um, and that America only dropped the nukes not to end the war, not to end fascism, but to establish a period of complete hegemony where nobody else had weapons to this scale, so that America was able to rob the entire world of the fruits of our victory and establish complete total control of all of these colonies and territories that we all fought to liberate during the decades of resistance. Um, and so this question of the nuclear question is extremely, historical in that sense. And so today, China unveiling our nuclear weapons North Korea having their nuclear weapons are the most important strategic guarantee of our sovereignty. It's not for aggression. China has a no first use policy, has always had a no first use policy. Um, these are, necessary. We learned from our own history in the 50s that if you don't have nuclear weapons, America can do whatever it wants. It was, when China was involved in the Korean War, what we call 抗美援朝, against America, help North Korea or help Korea. When we were involved in this war, right, we wanted to see peace and liberation on our land and in our neighbors' lands. And the what essentially ended the war and in the stalemate that we have today, both on the Korean Peninsula and in the Taiwan Strait, was because of the nuclear threat that America held over us. They said, if you don't stop fighting, we're going to nuke Pyongyang, we're going to nuke Beijing, and if you try to do anything against Taiwan, we're going to nuke you. And there was no resistance against that because no one else had nuclear weapons at the time. This is why China developed nuclear weapons, why the Soviets developed nuclear weapons, and why North Korea did. So we learned from our history that deterrence is really the only thing, being powerful is the only thing that will, force the imperialists to back down. And this like sense of national resistance and power is, I think, one of the most important takeaways for correctly framing our history. If you look at this history and examine it, there's, I think, no way you can arrive at the conclusion that China is the aggressor or will ever be the aggressor. So that background is paramount to understanding where we are today.
Those are great reflections from both of you and Jin, especially yours on what it means to have these military capabilities today. I want to come back to that when we're talking about the victory parade. But yeah, Charles, I mean your reflections were also fantastic. Parsing through the different aspects of the war, what its reality sort of really was in terms of its especially its liberatory potential. I want to come back to that. But just a couple of points here on the US taking over sort of Japan's role in the region. I recently read, right? Like, I mean, even in dead to rights, and a big part of the Japanese occupation was the conscription of so-called comfort women, sex slaves essentially, and we saw that as well in dead to rights. This was a major issue in China, in Korea. Some of these women are still alive. None of them have received justice. The Japanese have never apologize for the Nanjing massacre, let alone these instances of sexual slavery. Um, and on sort of this aspect of the US taking over Japan's role. I mean, I recently read that there are women in Korea still continuing to look to get justice because this system of comfort women or sexual slavery continued, right? Under US occupation between the 50s into up into the 80s. You'd have areas in Korea whose economies were entirely oriented toward uh, the presence of the military occupiers, the GIs from the US, and part of this were, you'd have in particular regions restaurants and bars and but also brothels with these sex slaves or so-called comfort women, for which these women are continuing to seek justice, and the Japan especially and the US as well would rather have these women just slowly age out and die, rather than to acknowledge this historical legacy and confront it and apologize. This is yeah, I mean, this is the reality of the situation. Um, Jin, on your point on sort of confronting history and confronting our own history, it's interesting. And about again about how this on the topic of how the eastern side of the war is really under not as well known. I mean, I was recently trying to reconnect with a teacher of mine from Hong Kong. I noticed that he was, at a particular school now. This was a teacher from really quite a long time ago. I happened to stumble upon, the history of this school. And, I found out that, again, I don't know this history. I didn't know this history, that this was, this school was the site of a really horrific, massacre by the Japanese during World War II. I mean, uh, a lot of schools, including my own during World War II, served as, hospitals. Mine in particular operated by the British before it was taken over by the Japanese. Um, but this school of my teachers, was also operating as a hospital, right? And the Japanese came in and massacred people, bayoneted people, all sorts of horrors. The numbers were above 100 in terms of how many people they slaughtered. Uh, yeah, and these local histories, I think really need to be better known, and I'm implicating myself here in this, as well directly. Um, and then the last thing, this on this Western framing of World War II, and as you were saying, Charles, focusing on the inter-imperialist rivalry side of things, the U.S. And the liberal West against the Nazis in Europe, um, entirely overlooks why, how the world came to be shaped afterward, right? And the liberatory potential that the struggle for socialism and for national liberation contributed to what we think of today as modernity, right? You had between 20 to 35 million people martyred in from China in this war. Several million others, so similar numbers, of Soviet citizens martyred as well. These were people that were attempting to build socialism. These were people that were waging their own national liberation struggles. I mean, if we have any sense of modernity, arriving into modernity, and even the premise of the end of history kind of framing is that we have arrived in modernity, and yet there's no recognition of how the struggles for socialism and national liberation played a primary role in World War II and in shaping our world today. So just some reflections there. I don't know if anyone had anything to add onto that, in hot pursuit. Otherwise, I would continue. But Charles, yeah, go
Yeah,
ahead.
I guess to add to that, right? Um, Specifically with regards to, China and its civilian, but especially military sacrifices. There's been, a species of like both Western discourse and also sort of like overall like liberal discourse in places like Taiwan, for example, right? That has taken a more subtle revisionist tack with regards to the historical remembrance of the victory in the People's Republic of China specifically, right? And this came to a head around the time of the parade. Which is that they specifically denigrate the role of the communists in that victory, right? Um, or they kind of flip the script and they say, oh, the Communist Party of China is taking like a disproportionate amount of the credit for defeating Japan, and yeah, this is like a load of really ahistorical BS for a lot of reasons. Um, but basically, what the narrative for them is like, oh, the People's Republic wasn't even founded until 1949. So according to them, right, like who was actually doing the vast majority of the fighting and dying? They look at the raw numbers and they say, oh, actually, it was the nationalists, right? It was the Kuomintang. Um, and yeah, this really gets everything backwards, historically and in terms of the actual course of the war itself in its most intense phase. Because if you look all the way back to 1931, right, when the Japanese first invaded and occupied northeast China, and established the puppet state of Manchukuo there, right. Um, Almost immediately after that engagement and a few others in Shanghai, like the nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek came to basically an agreement, the Tanggu Truce, with the Japanese. And so like we're, if you like stop where you are now, we're not going to put up more resistance. And the idea was to dedicate their military resources to crushing the communists, right? Especially in their base area of Yan'an. And it was the communists who, throughout the entire first half of the 30s, were the leading force in Chinese society that was arguing instead for national unity and for active resistance against Japan. Right? It was the communists almost exclusively who organized the underground military resistance in the Northeast, the Northeast anti-Japanese United Army, which also included many Koreans like Kim Il Sung. And you know, ultimately, like Chiang Kai-shek had to be like forced literally at gunpoint when he was kidnapped in Xi'an by some of his own lieutenants, right, to actually form this united front with the communists and resist Japan, just in time for their full scale invasion of the rest of China starting in 1937. And then during the war itself, it is true that, the nationalists, because they controlled most of China territorially, they had all these advantages in terms of manpower, in terms of equipment and so on. And so, they're parts of this unified army, right? We're fighting most of the set piece battles against Japan. But, the communists, as part of this united front, incorporated their forces into the KMT-led National Revolutionary Army, right, as the Eighth Route Army and the new Fourth Army, and they played an extremely crucial role that was complementary to this, and that I don't think it makes any sense to like, weigh in relative importance, which is that they had all of this experience of People's War, of guerrilla war, right, of like mobilizing the masses of the population in rural areas outside urban centers to the cause of national liberation and as you mentioned of social liberation as well, right? This vision of building a future after the war that was much more just than what came before. And it was because of that, right? And because of the communists and their activities sort of behind enemy lines, that Japan never secured control over any appreciable like swaths of the countryside outside cities, right? That their logistics, their train system, between cities, was so frequently attacked, and that's the part of the story that's left out, right? Is people today who are trying to relitigate this question, they completely ignore the fact that it was a joint struggle. It was one that between the two forces, the communists were in fact prosecuting militarily for much longer, and when they accuse like the party and the state in the People's Republic of historical revisionism, they're ignoring the fact that like at an official level, the CPC has always acknowledged these facts, right? Has always honored the memory of the KMT veterans, millions of whom wound up like defecting to the communists in the final stage of the Civil War, and remaining in the mainland, right? Of course, there were also millions who were forced to join their commanders in fleeing to Taiwan. But that too is something that the government in the lead up to this parade like explicitly acknowledged. It invited KMT veterans from the mainland and Taiwan to attend the parade, and there were a fair number who crossed the strait from Taiwan and did so in order to participate in this really moving like joint commemoration of their sacrifice, even though their own U.S. puppet government, which has been like advancing the separatist, pro-Japanese, pro-West, hyper-partisan perspective that actually denigrates their sacrifice, right? Was really pulling out all the stops to prevent them from going. So I just wanted to put that out there because like as you mentioned, this emancipatory aspect of the war was such a crucial element of it, and it was one that was very much present in China as well, in a way that these more subtle revisionist narratives in the West and also in its various proxies in the region completely occludes.
Thanks for that, Charles. Um, okay, I wanted to, maybe move to talking a little bit about the military parade itself, or the victory parade, I should say. Um, and, sort of I wanted to talk about two aspects of this. The first is sort of the Western media perspective of this, and you'll have known by now that one of the this is unbelievable. One of the viral clips coming out of this parade, um, and I wanted to start off this segment talking about this in particular because it really, I think, sets the agenda for how the West perceives this. But one of the viral clips from this is um, uh, you know, uh, the so-called hot mic, okay, where Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin, and of course Kim Jong-un was there as well, but this was really a conversation between Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin, where I presume that the context was, look at, back then, 80 years ago compared to now, people didn't used to live that long back then, and now, people are living, healthy lives, at 70 or upwards of 70, that kind of thing. This is Xi Jinping saying this, and I think Vladimir Putin responds by saying, "Yeah, and technology is advancing, and we can live even longer." And see, it really sounds like this was a joke. C was saying, "Oh yeah, like maybe in the future, people with all this will be able to live up to 150." And this just went. The West went absolutely nuts about this. This went viral. I saw a YouTube short of the CNN reposting this footage. And again, side note, to call this a hot mic is absolutely ridiculous because a hot mic is when, when you're caught saying something you shouldn't, when you don't know that there's scrutiny. This is the most choreographed thing ever. Like this is a normal conversation. I mean, think of two older gentlemen just having, a conversation between each other, and it's spun in this kind of way. And I opened the comments of that YouTube short, and it's all these Westoids that are like, oh my God, the rich are so disgusting, look at these people, and this is like the function of this is to sort of pathologize, right, the Easterners, and Russia gets lumped into this as well, right, as Asiatics, right, and this pathology of the authoritarian, the dictators, with the aesthetics in the background of the military parade. They're talking about taking over I mean, and sorry, I'm going on a rant here, but these, Westerners that are commenting like this and reflecting like this, right? It's really like a projection of their own their own environment, right? And these are really reflections of how the Western elite think, and that sort of forms the basis for people to then project this onto Asian leaders who are far greater in stature than any Western leader can be, like any of these days. But I wanted to open it up with that because that's to open it up by talking about the Western perception of this and how it's framed. um I've put it on the table. Feel free to take it away. Maybe we can start with Jin.
Yeah, I think that's a great starter. It's so funny that that became like the leading headline post in the military parade. Like you're saying, like they know they're being recorded. They know and people can hear everything. So it's truly so telling. The West is always telling on themselves, like the freakish ways they could interpret like a normal conversation. Like what are we doing all this for if not for like technological advancement to like all live longer and better lives? Like even a normal conversation around that subject is twisted in their mind. And on the note of like health and longevity, the walk from like Tiananmen Square, where you go in and then up the stairs and up the almost a zigzag to get to the top, that is a very long walk. And they all like They all did that so well. I'm happy that Trump wasn't there because if he was there, I don't think he would have made it up there. That's like kind of a physically strenuous test. Like, I thought that was kind of funny. It's sort of in my head, I imagine that they have these like giant elevators in the Tiananmen Square. I really did not expect all of them to like go up the ramp and then stairs and then ramp and then stairs. Um, but yeah, the that narrative, it's truly so funny. But about the military parade in general, like, not only that conversation, but also this whole idea of like, Xi Jinping, Putin, and then Kim Jong-un. It's such a, new Cold War narrative construction because China didn't choose necessarily who was up there. China only chose who was invited. And China invited a lot of people because we're not celebrating China or the Communist Party or anything like that. We're celebrating the anniversary of victory against fascism. And so China invited the South Korean government, they invited, they actually didn't, I think, end up inviting the Americans, but at some point they said that they were going to. But I think it was sort of a trade war narrative thing that they chose not to invite Trump in particular. But they invited, many European countries, anyone who was involved, like in Xi's opening speech for the military parade. And one of the things he said first was, thank you to the world's people that helped China in our battle against fascism. This is supposed to be a show of international solidarity, of human progress, of our mutual desire for peace. That's what this event is about. But then, the West chose to frame it in this authoritarian way of, three dictators talking about living forever. It's such an incredible takeaway from this event that is truly, in every way centered around peace and mutual prosperity, centered around sovereignty and self-determination. When the three helicopters flew in carrying the banners of justice will win, the people will win, these are the messages that China has repeatedly, over and over again, been putting out to the world. This idea that China's military is for peace and for the people is not a new thing today. It's not a new thing that we, have to say now because we're really strong. It's something that China has been saying since the 40s, the 50s. In almost every single military parade China has ever had, we have consistently reiterated the fact that the people's army is for peace, not just for China, but for the entire world. Because this is a military that, grew out of the resistance against Japanese, against fascism, against the war in Asia. It's a military that grew out of like understanding sacrifice and struggle, that sometimes you have to fight in order to protect, what's right and your people, but that also fighting and war comes with an immeasurable amount of pain and suffering. So this is a military that understands death, that understands what it means to fight a war. And so this is why China has consistently over the last 70 years reiterated over and over again that we are and will always be for peace. And this message, it just flies right over the head of American commentators. And it's funny because, China, this is the last military parade that China held was in 2019, was 6 whole years ago. And what has been happening in these 6 years? Every single year, the America has like multiple full-scale military parades with nuclear weapons, with like the giant navy, just the whole 9 yards, right? Dropping bombs, live round exercises, multiple of this every single year in the Asia Pacific. They just had in August the Wuxi Freedom Shield, which happens twice a year, off the coast of China in our waters and seas. It happens just, I can't even count between 2019 to 2025 how many of these America has conducted in the Asia Pacific. Like how Marco Rubio said, America it's a Pacific power, it's a Pacific nation. Like, where do you even start with that, right? Who really wants war? Who really wants peace? It's truly, I don't think, can get any clearer than that. And then, recently, also a few months ago, when America had its last military exercise with the puppet government in South Korea, where they accidentally dropped bombs on a Korean village. Stuff like this happens repeatedly over and over again. The largest military base that America has is in South Korea. They recently installed more long-range missiles capable of hitting every single city in China. They installed this in the Philippines. All of these things are rising like regional tension in the areas around China, all of it done in the name of containing China. So it truly doesn't get any clearer than this, who is the real aggressor here in the region. The one military parade that is, none of these weapons that we showcased, that China showcased, were like mounted on the ship, like how America does its military exercises. We, just peacefully driving through Beijing, China's own territory, showing, containment is now a dream. You should no longer try to contain China and try to, start war with China in the region because the military and is very powerful. All of this is done in the name of deterrence because Chinese people, more than anyone else, know what war feels like and want to see peace.
Charles, yeah, I want to get you in on that and in terms of, the Western media reaction. I also wanted to, get your thoughts because Jin was mentioning earlier about what this means in terms of, the military hardware that was shown during the parade so what does this mean? This is certainly significant, but I wanted to get your thoughts on the significance of this military advancement and development by China as well, in addition to your thoughts on sort of how the Western reaction's been.
Yeah, absolutely. Just to go back to the hot mic moment that you introduced this segment with, I want to add like a few points. Um, we can't, I mean, we don't really know the context for that clip, right? But I think it is notable that when they were talking about, human lifespan and the possibility of extending it, they were, about to ascend the rostrum of Tiananmen. And, if you go further in the actual footage, you see that the first thing they do when they get there is they greet these actual veterans of the war itself, right? Who, this is the 80th anniversary. So these veterans are, the official news coverage, right? It went down the list. It named them. It gave their ages. Most of them are in their like late 90s or like there are a few that are over 100, right? So and as I mentioned earlier, these weren't just veterans of the communist forces that fought. They also included KMT veterans, all being greeted personally by Xi Jinping, by Putin, by Kim, by all these leaders, right? And so I think that's notable context, right? Just that they're at like an event that's so freighted with historical memory and about to be in the presence of people who actually lived through that and fought through that. The other thing I want to mention is that like, you had this kind of like throwaway line from Xi Jinping about people maybe one day living to 150, which would be close to a doubling of present day life expectancy. And, this is happening in a country where, in fact, over the course of one generation, after the revolution of 1949, life expectancy did double in China, right? Just in the Mao period alone, it went from about 35 at the end of World War II to about 65, right? And it's kept going up since. In fact, in 2020, quite famously, life expectancy in China exceeded that of the U.S. for the first time. In large part because of the very different approaches that they took to COVID, but that gap has remained since then because quality of life, the institutional longevity of the healthcare system and so on, like all of those diverging trends in China and the U.S. have continued, right? And so where this notion of life of lifespan extension is perceived by so many Westoids, as you said, right, as like the exclusive preserve of billionaires, because those are the people, these like Silicon Valley, demons, right? Um, in China, it's something that people could very well have like a realistic expectation of actually like all partaking in, right, as a common good for all people. um yeah, and then on the question of the military hardware on display, I'm relying almost entirely on other people's commentary here because I'm not an expert myself, but from what I recall, over 80% of what was on display, was being shown publicly for the first time. Um, and I guess a lot of what drew the most attention were, not just the ICBMs, right? The nuclear warheads, as Jin mentioned, but a whole sort of battery of like conventional weapons that you know basically are as effective for defensive purposes as tactical nukes, but that would not cross the nuclear threshold. And this is a way of really putting teeth behind China's very principled no first use policy, because these are basically intended to show the U.S. right that it's in an act of aggression, direct territorial aggression against China, which is how any kind of kinetic war would go down is the U.S. would be the aggressor, right? Um, uh, all of its assets would be at risk in the region, and China would not have to, be the first to escalate up the nuclear ladder in order to do so, right? You also had a lot of drone, technology that was on display, both on air, sea, and land. I think this is speaking to, the fact that this is the direction that we've seen, especially in Ukraine, and to some extent as well, in West Asia as well, right? That warfare is going, and it's a statement that in terms of productive capacity, in terms of in terms of technological development, China is on the cutting edge. It's very much monitoring these evolutions in warfare that are happening in real time on these battlefields elsewhere, and it's going to do everything in its power to ensure that those battlefields do not extend to its own territory and its own vicinity. But it won't be caught unprepared, right? If the U.S. in its mad drive to war does escalate to that point. Um, yeah, I don't know if Jin, you had like other thoughts about the hardware in particular, but
Yeah, I'm also not a military expert at all, but I saw a lot of people focus on like the huge laser thing. I don't know the details of what it does, but from what I've seen other people say that it was like a really good example of like non-lethal deterrence. But yeah, all of these weapons that that China unveiled, none of it is about like going across the Pacific and fighting America. All of it is about like it's like almost only good for protecting its own like regional solid integrity. And I think that it's just such a stark contrast to the type of military display that America engages. Like China's not building military bases in other parts of the world. It's just trying to, showcase these weapons that's basically just a big sign that says "Don't fuck with us." And I think that's a very powerful message. And if you listen to the official commentary for like the military parade, it was like pure poetry for 2 hours. The people, there are a lot of things that they said are very were not like easily said. These are like highly thought out narratives that China wanted to put out. One of the things that it said was, humankind, mankind is once again at a crossroad. where the law of the jungle is rearing its head. These are the important moments where we have to find a way forward toward peace. And these are messages to America and to Western imperialist power in general. I think also the commentary made reference to, warfare and the destruction in other parts of the world. I think recently in China's new white paper, 2025 white paper of like America's like human rights violations and crimes, they had talked about the genocide in Gaza. And so all of these things are very much present in the forefront of China's mind when they were writing these narratives for the military parade. That, we have to find ways to resist imperialist encroachment and, bring about peace in the world where we can, mutual prosperity and develop together.
Yeah, thanks for that. And just on this question of the military side of things and um yeah, I mean 84% something like that was newly unveiled military equipment produced in China. And what it's important to emphasize, right? This is like much of the supply chain, if not all of it, is within China itself. These are being manufactured in China. And not just that, the research and design, right, is indigenous, right? And so when we talk about, you know, in the West, we like to talk about, decolonization and actually existing decolonization. This really is it, right? Let's not forget that the history of imperialism, and by that I mean the history of capitalism, is this sort of, as Samir Amin calls it, walking on two legs, right? There's the military aspect of it and the economic aspect of it, right? Of course you have, sort of a drain of surplus value or flow of wealth, right, coming from the peripheries of the world system into the core, from the global south into the global north, in rough terms. Those are economic mechanisms, but how these got kick-started, right, was and maintained, importantly, is through military coercion, right? Europe, a insignificant part of the world, like 500 years ago. There was this joke by this Indian comedian recently, Biswa Kalyan Rath, who was talking about how he was talking about how he doesn't know how Europe can be called a continent. Europe is, in fact, the arm of Eurasia, and that's pretty much it. Anyway, but this relatively historically insignificant part of the world, this relatively backward part of the world, was able to dominate for 5 centuries and going, but hopefully in decline, was through their triumph in, military technology, and particularly in, naval capacities, right? Take China, for example. China's defenses, military defenses, had never had sort of a naval component of it, because most of their military concerns were, one, over land, but two, coming from the north. I mean, this explains the Great Wall, et cetera, et cetera. And so, when Hong Kong gets, when the century of humiliation really starts, and it really does start with, around the time that, and coinciding with, the occupation and colonization of Hong Kong, that was, in large part due to the differential in naval capacities and military capacities. Fast forward now, 150 plus years after Hong Kong was first taken. Now, China's, navy has built up significantly to the point where it is the largest, has the greatest shipbuilding capacity in the world, right? In order to defend itself. I mean, folks, if that's not actually existing decolonization, I don't know what is. And I'm making these connections because they're very important, right? And they're very important to dispel against, some of these anti-China tropes, right? Characterizing China as imperialist or capitalist. I mean, and these military advancements are really, again, an assertion of sovereignty, a form of defense. If, there's no question China's dominated the economic side of things, and is posing an economic challenge, to the West, in great part due to its, socialist orientation of development. That's one side of things. On the other side of things, if imperialism's success streak really has been, initiated and maintained, through the military side of things, then it only makes sense, as Jin was saying, that you need to have, counter kind of defenses, right? Defenses that go counter to the military might of the West, and that's what this is, right? Gene was talking about the relevance of nuclear weapons, and it's really the same there as well. And the difference is so stark, right? When we talk about these veteran soldiers, really one of the most, I reacted very emotionally to that. Like, think about their lives, right? These are people, like you said, Charles, most of them were in their 90s. I think the oldest one, at least on that stage, was 102. I mean, these were young guys, if not kids, right? Like in their late teens when they were, guerrilla fighters, or if not guerrilla fighters, then rudimentary level in terms of technology soldiers, right? And think about how different, think about the life, or the lives that they lived from back then to now, and the kind of advancement, this kind of developmental trajectory that China's taken, the socialist oriented trajectory. I mean, it's incredible. And again, to bring it back to Gaza and Palestine, and you think of the destruction and the and in higher technology kinds of ways today than could have ever been imagined at that point. What we're seeing in Gaza was essentially what we all saw in Dead to Rights, right? The Nanjing massacre, the kind of humiliation, the kind of hopelessness, the kind of mental colonization that of defeat, right? And then fast forward, 100 or 80 years, I guess, from then, and this is a real stark difference, a real advancement in sovereignty. Uh, and again, I'll say it again, actually existing decolonization, it really sets an example for the rest of the world who, or I should say the rest of the global South who that there is hope, there is a trajectory, there is a way to decolonize, there's a way to develop your societies, bring people out of poverty, to defend yourself, right? To actually defend yourself, unlike the rubbish that that the Israeli regime claims, right? Um, and then maybe last thing here, when we were talking about who who was invited to the parade itself, and the importance of remembering history, right? It was a breakthrough that Prime Minister Modi of India was invited to the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and held a bilateral, that kind of thing. He didn't stay for the parade, but lesser known fact. I mean, you ask Indians, right? In general, this is not a common memory, but the Japanese aggressed against India as well, right? They bombed Calcutta, in the eastern part of India, a long time former capital of the British India, and the British imperial presence in Asia, right? Because Calcutta was like a hub, a logistics hub to transfer resources into China, actually, to counter the Japanese. And for Modi not to show up at this event, I mean, it I guess it speaks for itself. But I guess the point I wanted to bring up here is the importance of remembering history, and not shoving it aside. Okay, I wanted to move now to sort of the last segment here to talk about the new Cold War. There are two dimensions here I want to talk about. First, this was um, we're talking about the victory against fascism, 80 years ago. Um, was this an absolute victory? It's, starting to look like it wasn't, obviously. I mean, Charles, you mentioned that a lot of the Nazis themselves were, rehabilitated, migrated to, parts of North America, South America, found refuge in a lot of the regimes, the reactionary regimes in Latin America, were integrated into NATO, and the Japanese were normalized and rehabilitated, that kind of thing. So maybe I wanted to begin this I guess last segment by talking about, what is fascism today? How are we seeing it today? I mean, I was listening to, again, a conversation on Millennials Are Killing Capitalism, with Corinna Mullen, talking about how uh, uh, you know fascism, drawing on the sort of George Jackson analysis of fascism, is really the response of capitalism when there is a crisis of accumulation. And you see this in the greatest sense in Gaza, where people talk about, is it Israel? Is it the US? But I mean, This is what US-led imperialism permits and allows to take place when such a threat as Palestinian resistance to Zionism, threatens accumulation, capitalist accumulation on a world scale more broadly, right? Uh, you know, uh, uh, the West Asia region where Palestine is located is of strategic and consequential importance to world capitalism and accumulation on a world scale. Um, and when that's threatened, that's perhaps when fascism comes in. You have the analysis on the other side, um, not exactly on the other side, but you have the analysis of Vijay Prashad and the Tricontinental, who focus on the differences between fascism then and now, right? Having a historical conjunctural analysis of fascism, particularly as it arose in Europe, defined as really a reaction to greater socialist organizing or greater left organizing. That's really, in Europe how fascism emerged. Today, there is no such strong communist left for fascists to to organize themselves to crack down on fascists today, or what we can call fascists today. Largely, the electoral arena is quite open to them. It's amenable to them to to enter and to contest. So I wanted and of course, I can't go without mentioning, the relevance of the neo-Nazis in Ukraine, that in this conflict, between Russia and or Russia and NATO essentially. So, with all those things on the table, my apologies, I put a lot of things on the table, but with all of those things on the table, what is fascism today? How are we seeing it reemerge, if it is? Um, and what's the connection between that and sort of the new Cold War? Maybe here I will start with Charles.
Yeah, I mean, you did put a lot on the plate there. I think you pretty much covered the bases in terms of where fascism in its modern instantiation, occurs in its most concentrated and violent form today. And I think if the term is to have like continued relevance, we can't examine it in this very narrow historicized frame that like treats like German and Italian fascism of the 30s under that explicit name as like the model of fascism, right? And also divorces that from its broader colonial context. I think that if the term is to have continued relevance, then it needs to be seen as an intensification, in some ways a necessary intensification of existing colonial processes, right? Um, like in order to see them through to their intended conclusion. And the most concentrated distillation of that, as you mentioned, is the genocide, is the Zionist genocide in Gaza today. Um, that's not like a completely fleshed out um, I guess like typology of what fascism is per se. But I think in terms of the phenomena associated with it, yeah, unquestionably, like the um, the emblematic example of that is modern day Israel. And I wanted also to tie that back into what you mentioned earlier in terms of actually listing decolonization in the technical sphere, right? Because what we're seeing now, in the Palestinian resistance, in what remains of the broader axis of resistance, right? Principally Yemen and then also Iran during the recent 12-day war of self-defense against the Zionist entity, uh, is an object lesson in what it takes today to resist fascism, which really in its fundamentals is not so different from what it took to resist fascism in the actual world anti-fascist war 80 years ago. namely that it has to take the form of a people's war, and that it will necessarily be a technologically asymmetrical one, but one that depends in its fundamentals on the assertion of sovereignty, right? Of popular mobilization and of marshaling, all the resources that one does have, right, towards the purpose of you know of self defense, right? And we talked a lot about how in its most hyper modern form we see that we saw that on display at the parade in Beijing, but really in terms of this kind of technological self sufficiency in terms of armament, right? And really deploying it as effectively as possible against an aggressor. There is no better example today than Gaza itself, where the Palestinian resistance, even in the face of the worst genocide that any of us have seen in our lifetime, has continued to resist for 2 years, and has prevented uh, the entity from achieving any of its stated strategic goals, right? And it's done so because it's drawn on its indigenous productive capacity for weapons, as well as its intimate knowledge of the terrain that its people are rooted in, right? Both above ground and especially underground. And you have other examples. You have the fact that Yemen, right, like forced the U.S. into a ceasefire and, in fact, a strategic defeat. Um, Again, under conditions of siege, of blockade, of a genocidal assault by the Saudis that concluded only just before October 7th. And they've done so again with their own indigenously manufactured weapons, including the first use ever of anti-ship ballistic missiles, right? Which, of course, in a much more advanced form, you saw on display as well in Beijing. In the case of Iran, right? Again, entirely indigenously produced battery of ballistic missiles that, over the course of the recent 12-day war, forced the United States to use up 25% of its entire worldwide supply of THAAD interceptors, right? Um, and by the end of that war, like they were only accelerating the pace of their hits on Israel. So, you see the same story again and again here, right? Which is that when you're rooted in your people, rooted in your land, when you have, when you draw on your own capacity for self-defense, right? However asymmetrical, however ground down and blockaded you may be, that that is the end all and be all of resistance to fascism, and that resonates, I think, hugely with the historical memory in China today of their resistance to Japanese aggression, and this is why, especially at a popular level, right, there's been such an overwhelming response, to uh, you know not just the genocide in Gaza, but to the resistance, right? That people see, in the Qassam brigades, in the videos that they put out, like a mirror image of the kinds of guerrilla actions that bit by bit over the course of this grinding, brutal genocidal war, like wore down and ultimately broke the back of the Japanese war machine 80 years ago.
Yeah, I think with the re-election of Trump, obviously, like the idea of fascism, like Charles is saying, is not really that flushed out of an idea. But as like a hot topic, hot word, it's really been, resurfacing a lot within North America domestic politics. But when you think about it, I mean, how can you expect this country that continuously waged imperialist wars overseas for the last like hundreds of years to not bring that trauma home? I forgot who it was. I think it might have been Trotsky actually that wrote like an article that along the line of, to fight fascism, you must first fight imperialism. And I think that's very relevant today as we unfold into another era of the Cold War. Obviously with the re-election of Trump, like the domestic repression of political activists are increasing, and we can absolutely expect that to continue to escalate. Under, whichever president, as the U.S. empire is collapsing and failing in its wars overseas, we can definitely expect to see the same level of escalation in terms of a fascist U.S. government unfold here at home. And I think, to Charles's point about military technology, in America, the most benefit I have from military technology is probably like my phone or my computer. It's, so light and it's, runs so fast, and all of these like chip technology that we get from the military continuously developing next generation chips to like be used overseas to bomb people. These are the small, tiny fragments of benefits we get from, Western technological innovations. What we really get, we also at the same time get much worse aspects of this. We see the surveillance technology that's being used in Palestine coming back to be used in the fascist government of America. I saw an article about these like false cell phone towers that like ICE is now able to tap into anyone's phone at will. All of these are technologies that America developed over, Cold Wars in the past and Cold Wars in the present to be used in imperialist repression of the world's people are now coming back to be reemployed in US fascism against the domestic population. And then, pivoting to Asia, pivoting to China, what do we see over there? We see a country that has, in the same way, developed technology to be used for the military because, military technologies will always be the forefront of technological innovations. It's just how it is. But we also see a country that has never used its military um, technology against anyone. So, in the sense of development, innovation, and China actually benefits from its technological advancements much more than the rest of the world, right? We see that in their incredibly advanced, like, new energy, um, green vehicles, solar panels, all of those things, right? China is actually a society that benefits much more from its technological innovations than America ever will. Because for us, the priority is oppression. The priority for technology is how to use it to harm people and secure U.S. imperialist interests. And so I think this really highlights the connection between fascism at home and imperialism abroad, and how the Cold War is not just, the new Cold War is not just something that affects the people in China and the people in Palestine, that it really will always have a most profound, deep impact here at home, and that these two fronts have to be continuously readjusted and fought together at the same time because it's just so interconnected. And so when we talk about fascism and the rise of fascism in America, I think it's truly should be a secondary thought to the global struggle against imperialism and against empire and these like stooges of what's left behind from the colonial era. I think those are, always the forefront. I really like the framing of the most recent People's Conference for Palestine, where they continuously reaffirm that Gaza is the compass. I think this is a very important, a quick lesson for people to hold in their heart that the struggle for, liberation against imperialism is what guides us to, how we will fight fascism at home. And a funny anecdote about that, Americans like to talk about Trump and how he's fascist, but in China, they call him 川建国, right? Trump built the country builder, Trump the country builder. Because like for the international people overseas, if you're not American or North American, for people overseas, like this dude is sort of, not necessarily the worst thing that's happened to, to the globe, right? He really highlights like the decline of America and, bring together closer. India and China has is now closer than they've been in the past decades, right? Sort of because of Trump's like racist tariff rhetorics, all of these things. And I think really highlights, what Americans might see as the biggest fascist challenge is just another small chapter in our collective struggle toward liberation.
Those are some great reflections there. Yeah, I really appreciate it. Um, it's been quite a while. I don't want to keep you for too much longer, but we'll do one more round and then we'll wrap it up. I just wanted to uh, very important round to get our thoughts on uh, you know, prospects of war, right? I mean, uh the basis for this, right, is I was talking about imperialism, and accumulation on a world scale, China's sort of sovereign development, the fact that it's been able to develop itself and not, take up a subordinated position within the wider world system of imperialism, that threatens, right, the United States and the West more broadly. There are many dimensions you can get into that. And then, if the West can't economically compete with China, which it cannot because it's not going to invest in research and development, it's not going to invest in, greater productivity because, at the top of Western societies are leeches. They cannot help but facilitate an upward transfer of wealth at a greater and greater rate over time. That is capitalism. That And when you were saying, Jin, the difference between how technology is used in the West for repression versus in China, for the people, that is, you're essentially describing the difference between capitalism and socialism. Anyway, that's a side tangent. But if if the West can't economically compete, it will do what it is good at, what it has been good at for 500 years, violence, imperialism. Let's not forget, right? We were talking about, the US and Western powers, and their imperial expeditions outward, right? Um, the US and Canada, where I'm based, are only so because they did this imperial expedition on this continent, right? Settler colonialism, and obviously, Canada today is, hypothetically future Israel, right? Like what Israel hopes to be, but will not. Um, so you know, in light of this, right, in light of Western decline, the West seems to be gearing up for war against China or war in East Asia more broadly, right? The question of Korea is also, very important here. And again, let's remember, right? These are World War II. When we talk about World War II, these are frozen conflicts, right? Taiwan and the mainland are not reunified. This is a a World War II, Cold War, frozen conflict. The same thing across the Korean Peninsula. Um, on the other hand, there have been some reports recently that in, the new, defense, policy papers, they are they're thinking of reorienting back toward the Western Hemisphere, and this, partly explains the aggression against Venezuela and the socialist project they're attempting to build there, and their connections that they're making with the rest of the global South, with China and Iran, etc. So, and of course, I can't not mention, the renaming of the Department of Defense and the Secretary of Defense in the U.S. to Department of War, Secretary of War. So you take all this together. On the one hand, we're very close to war. Like there's no denying that we're very close to war with China. There's talk of the Taiwan Strait or the South China Sea. On the other hand, there are these, there is this wavering a little bit. Hey, maybe should we focus on consolidating our imperial might, I guess, in the Western Hemisphere itself. What are our thoughts on this? I think I'll start with Jin here.
Yeah, I think, just in the same way that the Cold War of the past was a misnomer and was never cold, that's even more true today. The America today is not the America. I was looking at a stat the other day about the Belt and Road Initiative. We've been talking a lot about, I've been hearing a lot of stories about, BRICS and Belt and Road. The BRI actually, I think, connects 75% of the world's population. And then the BRICS countries represent 50% of the world's population. And I think about almost 50% of the world's GDP now is along the routes of the BRI. Um, and these are just, I think, important to remember because even talking about this, looming world conflict in the sense of a Cold War, I think honestly gives America too much power and positionality than it actually has. The Global South today is much more powerful and much more united than it has ever been before, right? The most important thing about the Belt and Road Initiative is not about, picking camps and who's siding with who, but the physical connection of everyone, whether inland country or not, to the world at large, to the global economy. That has given many countries a degree of sovereignty that they have never before had access to, whether to their own production capacities, economy, how they would like to orient, their countries like manufacturing and things like that. All of these things, I think, China has learned from the Soviet Union's mistakes, and the example in the past. All of these things have just now, China unveiled itself as this like new world power that we've honestly people have only been paying attention to for the last like 2, 3 years, right? Like people at large, the general population imaginary has now finally paying attention to China. And I think that's incredibly strategic because China today is ready now. The Belt and Road Initiative was unveiled in 2013, I think. And after, a decade plus of building, of connecting Global South, of improving South-South cooperation, we now are coming out and, as a new global, multipolar power. And then now America is saying, oh, the Cold War new conflict with China. Like it's maybe a little bit too little, too late. And so I think, in framing the conflicts that the obstacles that we'll face moving forward, it's very important to continuously uplift, I think, the power of the people. And so yeah, when it comes to thinking about the new Cold War and, any potential military conflicts, I think it's important to remember that there has always been conflict, that America has almost never not been active hot war. Um, so yeah, it's just another chapter of the continuous battle.
Yeah, I think Ashwin and Jin, you both gave like, a really good holistic global picture of it. So I suppose, to wrap up, I want to talk a little bit more about the specifics of uh, at least how I'm viewing the specific question that you raised, Ashwin, about the prospects for kinetic war directly between the US and China. And, there I think, uh, you have to look at the actual behavior of the US, even under the intensely sort of mercurial Trump regime when it comes to actual military engagements, at least, within the however many months, 8, 9, right, that we've experienced so far, which is that, you know, the empire's actual willingness to get into prolonged like military engagements has scaled very much, I think, with the actual deterrent capability of its opponent, right? We saw it wrap up, its futile attempt to suppress the resistance in Yemen within about 2 months. In the case of Iran, they were crying uncle within 12 days, and it was what certainly seems to be an almost symbolic one-off strike by the U.S., right? Um, and I think in both cases that was because of the deterrent capability that Yemen and Iran respectively showed. So if we take that data, right, and look at the situation right now in China, like overwhelmingly, the main area of risk for actual kinetic hot war to break out between the U.S. and China would be over Taiwan. But China has made its red lines very clear, right? Basically, the condition for like military reunification, which is very much not the preference of the people or the government of the People's Republic of China, would be a unilateral declaration of independence by the Taiwan authorities. And even though they are, ghoulish, pro-West, pro-Japan, historical revisionist separatists, I also don't think that even this current ruling bloc in Taiwan is as suicidal as, for example, the post-Maidan regime in Ukraine, right? Um, and uh, even though the U.S. has come out with these supposed prospective dates, right, for when it supposedly anticipates military action by China. First, they said 2025. Now they're saying 2027. You know, I don't think these track at all with the reality of the situation, which is that, this kind of like really patient long game that China, that mainland China has been playing in terms of building up people to people exchange, right? And waiting for both the global geopolitical conjuncture and the local political dynamics within Taiwan itself to evolve in a more favorable direction. It's finally seeing this year, I think, a lot of payoff and a lot of movement in the right direction. The population in Taiwan, is now overwhelmingly rejecting, the overreach and the extreme fixation, by this very much like minority ruling clique, right? Surrounding the question of cross-strait relations. They rejected like all 31 of the legislative recalls that they attempted to levy against the opposition KMT legislators who, although also anti-communist, are much more in favor of warmer cross-strait ties, right? And then at the popular level, and especially within, interestingly, the younger generation that, within recent decades has been moving until now more and more towards like localist identification with Taiwanese nationalism as opposed to a Chinese identity. We're seeing like a lot of their most vocal influencers, completely changing their script about mainland China after having visited, right? After having like, shown their massive audiences, okay, this is the truth of life in mainland China. And basically pivoting towards a message of peace, right? And that's not yet necessarily like full blown, full throated support for reunification under like a one country two systems kind of arrangement, but things are moving much more in that direction, and it definitely is the common preference of people on both sides of the strait. I think more and more for that to continue, and I think the conditions are getting more and more favorable. So that will remove basically the linchpin of what the U.S. calls the first island chain encircling China, and the main potential flashpoint for hot war. So I think both in terms of the overt military and technological deterrent that was on display in Beijing during that parade, and in terms of the developments across the strait. I'm seeing a lot more hope this year than in a lot of for a lot of the recent decade. I think that you know we're at a real turning point against the U.S. drive to war in the region. Um, yeah.
Thanks for that, Charles. Um, Yeah, I think this is a good place to wrap our conversation. It's been quite a while, and I think, I really appreciate this conversation. It's been a very rich conversation. And we covered a lot of ground. So yeah, again, I really appreciate your time. You've been very generous with it. Let the listeners know where to find your work, your presence, both individually, as well as Chao's work. And maybe I'll start with Jin here.
Yeah, I'm just a proud member of the Qiao Collective. So, you can find our work on Instagram, but our main bulwark of our publications are on our website. But yeah, I'll leave it up to Charles.
Yeah, didn't pretty much said it. We have the same handle on all social media platforms, Qiao Collective. spelled QIAO, and ChiaoCollective.com is also our website. So yeah, be on the lookout for lots of exciting new material there.
That's great. I'll leave that linked in the description, and I'll also leave linked in the description those two pieces that Qiao Collective recently released. Thank you so much again, both of you. Really appreciate your time and really appreciate your very meaningful and very rich insights. Coming from very deep places. In contributing to this conversation. So thank you again.